I request the audience to share their questions in the box mentioned below, so that at the end of the presentation, we shall take it as a question and answer session. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you. Good evening to everybody. And to start with, I should thank JB Chemicals and all the audience who decided to dedicate some time in this period of lockdown and corona, and in a stage when everybody has been pushed to attend a lot of webinars, and we are all in a state where we detest attending webinars. But only thing is that this is not going to be on COVID. This is something of practical relevance to every practitioner. It is on hypertension, particularly resistant hypertension. So during the course of the talk, I'll try to project a case, and from there we'll try to approach the problem of resistant hypertension. And this is mainly to give you the concept of different types of hypertension, and particularly resistant hypertension, and how to approach it. So we may not have time to delve deeply into each and every drug we use for hypertension and all that, but I want to give you a good concept of hypertension, what is the importance of controlling it, and this, particularly this group of resistant hypertension. And beyond that, there is even a smaller group of refractory hypertension. I'll be making a mention of that. So I think we'll start. Yes. I think we have come a long way, talking about hypertension. It used to be somebody who said the greatest danger to man with high BP is in its discovery. He was so rude, and he thought there was no entity as hypertension, and there is difficulty in changing my. He thought there is no entity as hypertension, and if somebody starts to reduce the blood pressure, we'll land into a lot of more trouble than having the BP itself. I think this is just a historical perspective, and from that we have gone a long way, and we know the importance of hypertension, and we simply can't ignore it. But I always have a grouse, unlike diabetes, which is more, it is talked about very well like hypertension, but I think people delve more into diabetes and management of diabetes and getting into each and nook and corner of diabetes more than hypertension. I would say hypertension is talked about but not really acted upon. There are many reasons. One thing, there is no particular specialty to deal with hypertension. See, unlike diabetologists, there is no hypertensionologist. Mostly physicians do that work, nephrologists, cardiologists, they predominantly act on hypertension. So there is no particular community to concentrate on hypertension. And there is nothing, no measurement like HbA1c, which came into being in diabetes, where you can assess the total control or the control status of a particular patient. Whereas in hypertension, you don't have anything like that. You'll have to really depend on what you measure when the patient presents to you. And now, of course, we have other tools like, they are able to record by themselves at home, and automated BP monitoring and so on. But generally, we do not have a marker for an uncontrolled hypertension. So because of these factors, I think hypertension is not getting the real due it really deserves. But common sense would tell us what is high BP. Common sense should tell us that it is above which, the level above which treatment makes people, and make it a better time for them, decreasing death, morbidity, fewer brain, heart, and kidney events, and they live longer and healthier lives. This is a more of a philosophical concept or a definition. But we need to have figures. And these figures, unfortunately, cannot be same from everybody, because due to various reasons, I, for one, who believe that you can't have one value for everybody. And no wonder that makes this target values being changed every year by various agencies, JNCs, and various forums. But now we have a lot of controlled trials where they screen populations and they try to fix the normal from abnormal blood pressure. But again, I'm not going to go into the details because you hardly see much difference. It's all between around 130/80 and slightly lower in diabetics and slightly higher in old age. But the JNC8, lately they made it 140/90 even for the elderly. And the nephrologists are generally slow to take up all these changes. And to tell you the fact, the KDIGO, the latest KDIGO is yet to be released. It was supposed to be released in May. It has not yet come. And we generally fix BP level of 140/90 for somebody without proteinuria and take it slightly lower, 130/80 for people with proteinuria. And we don't talk about particular levels for older individuals, but in all other recommendations, older people, in some they have 10 millimeter less for elderly, and others maintain it at 140/90. So that apart, because these things might change every year, so we have a finite level which is supposed to be normal. And now we also know that the trend, the hypertension, is a very rapidly increasing disease burden. And now in 2025, we expect that the number of people affected in millions is going to be very huge. More than 100 million people in India would have diabetes. So it is a great problem, and we need to approach it very effectively. And what is the role of a nephrologist in that? Am I really poking my nose into that unnecessarily to a field which is not entitled to discuss in depth about hypertension? No, I don't think so. Do you recognize this man? This is none other than Richard Bright, the famous man who described most of the renal diseases. In 1841 itself, as back as 1841, he proposed that hypertension is some way connected to the kidney. So he could relate hypertension with kidney. He found contracted small kidneys in many of his hypertensives. So he thought hypertension had all, or if not mostly, to do with the kidneys. And going to the physiology also, blood pressure, we know it is a function of cardiac output and peripheral vascular resistance. And cardiac output, depends on the blood volume or the body volume. And the total body volume depends on the sodium content. And how is the sodium content controlled? It is by the kidneys. And how? By pressure natriuresis and by the renin-angiotensin system. So these two are very vital, which are inherently part of the renal system. So that is the major reason why kidney cannot be left without discussing in any forum where you talk about hypertension. And there are people who believe that even primary hypertension, or the so-called essential hypertension, is a renal disease. They think it is a sort of resetting of the normal by salt sensitivity by the kidney. And this pressure natriuresis, I will not discuss about all that, but very interesting. So kidneys try to reset the pressure when their salt sensitivity is increased. And so the BP is raised. So essentially kidney and the kidney man has to be there discussing hypertension. And from the root to the aorta to the glomerulus, the mesangium and the membrane or the basal membrane and the cells, it is the dominant role in kidney plays a dominant role in hypertension. So let me try to approach this problem of resistant hypertension through this case. So we have this is a day-to-day we come across such similar cases. A 49-year-old male, he was sent to me for evaluation of high blood pressure, 156/90. Obviously, by the standards given by various forums, this is not real control. And he is an engineer. He has a history of diabetes for 4 years and hypertension for 10 years. He was like obese with a BMI of 31, but he was not a smoker nor an alcoholic. He hardly had any symptoms except fatigue and some dry mouth. But he was on plenty of drugs, about which we'll see. And clinically, he did not show any evidence of target organ damage like LVH or cardiac disease or renal disease, nothing. He was simply hypertensive, taking a lot of drugs, which was probably not getting under control. So he comes to me. There was family history of hypertension in both parents. That was the only other positive thing. And this is the list of drugs he was on. He was on a diuretic, hydrochlorothiazide, 25 milligram. He was on an ARB, telmisartan, fairly good dose, 160. He was on calcium channel blocker, and usually he was on dihydropyridine, non-dihydropyridine calcium channel blocker, namely diltiazem, 90 milligram. He was on a sympathetic blocker, clonidine. He was on beta blocker. So he was nearly on 5 antihypertensive drugs. Yet his BP was 140/96, and he was on statin and metformin for his diabetes. What do you call this? It is obviously an uncontrolled hypertension, but that may not be that definition, or that term may not suffice. Or you can simply say a difficult to control hypertension, but even that won't suit. So then comes, so let us pick up the salient features in this problem of hypertension in this patient. He is hypertensive for 10 years and he has been on multiple drugs. He is on more drugs. He is on nearly 5 drugs, one of which is a diuretic, and still his BP is more than the target. And so with these features, this entity is called as resistant hypertension. So coming to the definition of resistant hypertension, it is somebody who has hypertension for a long time, which is not under control with 3 or more antihypertensive drugs, one of which should be a diuretic, and BP need not be always more than 140/90. It can be under control also, but if the number of drugs used is 4 or more, still it is abnormal. So resistant hypertension is defined with these parameters. And so our man has resistant hypertension. And beyond the resistant hypertension, there is another group of patient, who even with 5 drugs or more, they are not under control. They are called as refractory hypertension, about which we may not be discussing much today, but I'll be making some mention. So amongst the whole group of hypertension, this resistant group will be around 30%, so which is very high. And in our practice, if you recall, you'll see that there will be many patients like this, and you get to lose track of them. You get used to them. They're already on many drugs, and their BP lingers around 140/96 or so. You stop reacting much to it because you become refractory more than the disease, and this is often called inertia from the physician side. So we do have around 30% of cases who are resistant hypertensives. And when somebody is labeled as resistant hypertension, first thing is we think about secondary hypertension. We try to rule out secondary causes, but it is a different entity. It is not actually a resistant hypertension. Then the small group I was telling you about, refractive hypertension, who do not get controlled by whatever means you do, and that is a very small group. But should you worry about this resistant hypertension? Because if you remind yourself, there will be more scores of cases like this with you. But the problem is, we know that resistant hypertension patients have a lot of comorbidities. They are on high risk for all these comorbidities: coronary artery disease, peripheral vascular disease, cardiovascular disease, congestive failure, atrial fibrillation, proteinuria, renal disease, and so on. You see the odds ratio of risk from 1.3 to 2.4. So anything beyond 1 is high risk. So this is not a good situation. You can't leave this patient alone. You will have to react and do something for this resistant hypertension. And as a nephrologist, I'll be worried because GFR falls rapidly in this group of resistant hypertension. These darker shadows are those patients with resistant hypertension. You see that their GFR decrease is always more than the non-resistant hypertensive patients. So in other words, I would be equally worried, like all the comorbidities we listed, as a nephrologist, to bring this patient from resistive hypertension to normotension. Coming back to the case, so we try to evaluate him. His heart rate is regular. There is no atrial fibrillation, and he has no tachycardia nor bradycardia. His forelimb BP was checked. There was no inequality of BP between limbs or between upper and lower limbs, which could easily, rule out some of the major causes of secondary hypertension in form of coarctation and aorta arteritis and renovascular problem. And so this is very important that you do this in each and every patient of yours at least once when they come to you. And he was obese with the BMI of 31. So that is something to worry. We'll keep this in mind. Let us see how much this is related to his resistance. He had no postural hypotension. So he was on many drugs, but he was not on postural hypertension. And his fundus, which is an important part, which showed that there was mild arterial narrowing in the fundus, which is expected in a case of long-standing hypertension. There was no obvious cardiovascular disease, and clinical exam did not show any renal artery bruit. So, so in the preliminary examination itself, you try to rule out some of the secondary causes which could be the cause for his resistant hypertension. So approaching a case like this, we need to go systematically. First of all, you'll have to confirm that it is really resistant, because there is one group called pseudo-resistance, about which we'll see. Then some of them will have reversible factors in their lifestyles or the substances they use, the drugs they use, which could, if removed, they would come back to a normal BP person, not being resistant. Then the secondary causes, about which we'll see briefly. Then we'll go on to treatment in a very brief way, and let us see when you should be really referring them to a specialist. Then a word about this pseudo-resistance. The pseudo-resistance could be because of technical fault in measuring BP, or some problem with the cuff, and the monitor they use or your staff use, they may not be calibrated properly. And this may look very trivial to you, and why discuss such a thing in a very forum like this, where we are seriously talking about resistant hypertension. But you will realize this is a very important factor. And a clue which will tell you that there could be pseudo resistance is extreme variability in BP readings, from time to time. Different days, it is very high on one day and very low on one day. That could, of course, mean, indicate pheochromocytoma, which is very rare. But one thing you'll have to rule out is technical fault. And digital bias, again, people jump from 5 to 10, 0 to 5 and 5 to 10. So if the BP is recorded in either 0, 5 or 10, then again, you'll have to go back and really check it out. And I should tell you that we have so many screening tests, cancer screening, sugar screening, cardiac screening, renal screening, etc. But please believe me, most powerful screening test we have to premature death and disability, to avoid premature death and disability is just checking BP. So BP measurement is one of the most powerful screening tools to save lives. But unfortunately, this is rarely practiced according to real guidelines. And if you go back and see how much training was given to somebody to BP measurement, very trivial. And it is hardly discussed in any CMVs. And if you really conduct a serious test, only 5 to 10% would pass, to do an ideal BP measurement. And also, the sad fact is, if somebody goes wrong by mere 5%, say instead of 90, they say 85, say just 5% or 4% false measurement, that will miss nearly 40% of hypertensive patients who come through your clinic. See, so how serious the problem is, this technical fault in measuring BP. And this is just to show the difference between the nurses or the students who are made to take BPs over time. You see, during 1 month, between nurses, the variation is so much. And once they are given a training and pakka, calibration is done, later, the differences narrow down. So the variation could be very long, and there are things about silent gap and all those stuff. We'll not talk about. All of us are familiar, but we don't, give second thought to that. Actually, they say for an accurate measurement of BP, one has to spend at least 14 minutes, which includes the rest between, the average of 2-3 tests, and the time to be given for rest between measurement and so on. And now lately, the recent guidelines recommend that between manual measurement and automated, it's not the ambulant BP measurement, but automated electronic sphygmomanometers are better recommended these days. And there are manometers which take an average of 3 and gives a gap of 1 or 2 minutes between measurement and so on. So I think we are reaching a time when we would be preferring more on this automated manometers, but of course they'll have to be strictly calibrated and periodically checked. And the matters of cuff, again, I will not go into the details. One should keep in mind the size of the cuff and the circumference of the arm and so on, and where to keep the cuff. And the use of ambulatory BP measurement is, this has been available with us for quite some time, but its real use is being recognized more and more nowadays. And that has brought on entities like white coat hypertension and masked hypertension. So I wish more we use this to screen at least once in the lifetime of a patient. And it very beautifully brings about patients who have nocturnal hypertension, who have lost the nocturnal dip, and who have early morning spike. You have no way to measure this or pick up these patients. And we know that nocturnal hypertension has more prognosticating importance than daytime BP. And there will be people who you think apparently are under control, but their target organ damage is relentlessly progressing. Again, you ask for a ABPM and see if there is something going wrong. And between clinical blood pressure and the 24-hour ambulatory, you will get 4 quadrants like this. If the BP is normal by both the methods, it's true normal. If it is sustained in both the measurement, then it is sustained hypertension. But then you have these 2 areas: white coat hypertension, where it is always high in the clinic but normal at home and during 24-hour measurement, and masked hypertension. That is the thing. And white coat also, we are conscious, and sometimes we ask the patient to come back again or get it checked at home. But this masked hypertension is where the BP is always normal in front of the doctor in the clinic, but in the times unmeasured in the night and early morning, it is not there. So from this technical factors, we go on to some of the identifiable reversible factors in trying to approach this problem. It could be in the lifestyle or in the drugs they use. And lifestyle factors, it is always easy to profess than to practice. This is true regarding diet and so many things, behavior and everything. And please believe me that dietary sodium restriction alone can bring down the blood pressure, systolic 23 and diastolic 9. So this has been proven by randomly and changing patient from very low salt to high salt and giving a washout period in between, and they have found that as the difference could be as high as 20 millimeters systolic and 10 millimeters diastolic. So it is really worthwhile to look at their dietary intake. And how to assess dietary intake? There are many methods. Now we try to check the 24-hour urine sodium excretion, which can easily give away the amount of sodium taken, because kidney is such a wonderful organ. It can excrete any amount of sodium depending on the intake. But only thing, it will reset the BP. You give him 5 grams, it will excrete 5 grams. If you give him 10 grams, it will excrete 10 grams. Only thing, when you take 10 grams, your BP will be a few millimeters higher. So this is what I was telling you about pressure natriuresis hypothesis. So sodium intake is very vital even to this day. In spite of all our medications, I think this is an important factor. And next is the weight. And weight, again, it may not be that obvious as sodium restriction, but again, it can make a change of 6 to 8 millimeters when you reduce the weight by 5 kilograms. And other important factors are non-adherence of the therapy. You give a prescription, they come back, and you take a deep inquiry, you'll find that many of them, some of them at least, especially the so-called resistant hypertension, do not take drug properly. And many times it is suboptimal doses. And this is, it is pointing a finger at ourselves. Many times we underdose. And one rough estimate will be, you look at the pharma companies or the guidelines, maximum dose allowable for a particular drug, and at least you should give 50% of that. I think that will roughly, because one may not be as bold as to use the maximum dose. So you target at least 50% of the maximum dose prescribable for a particular drug. So suboptimal dosing is also a crime. So that is it from our part. And you should look at the drugs or other substances they are taking, and there can be very innocuous ones. Some might be very obvious, like oral contraceptives or NSAIDs or other steroids, or for a transplant patient or my patient, cyclosporin, erythropoietin. These may be very obvious, and most of us are aware. But there can be very many non-prescription substances which may be there in the lifestyle of this patient, which needs more probing. They may be on some recreational drugs or some addiction, and they may be taking unknowingly cough remedies and so on, which contain drugs, substances which can increase the blood pressure. So having ruled out technical problems and having seen the reversible factors in their lifestyle and their drugs, then you move on to secondary hypertension. See, secondary hypertension is not actually a resistant hypertension. This is a different entity, but only thing we like to rule out secondary hypertension whenever you have a patient who has uncontrolled hypertension. And there is a very big list, but just remember we'll have to rule out renal hypertension and adrenal problems and sleep apnea, which I would put it under secondary hypertension. And this large miscellaneous category, there are hundreds, but they are very rare, and we may not. And many of them show it on the face very easily. They'll have some congenital deformity, some other obvious malformations which will hit us on the face. So we'll have to be careful to rule out renal, adrenal, and keep in mind sleep apnea. So renal, I would say it is very easy. So if you have examined the routine examination, like urine examination, if there is some proteinuria, you know that there is some renal dysfunction. Something wrong with the kidney. It may not be the only reason, but there is something wrong in the kidney. So urine albumin examination is a must, not only in diabetics, in everybody. Then doing an ultrasound is a must. I would say any hypertension case, anybody who comes to you before starting a prescription, please do an ultrasound. And if there is increased echoes, yes? If there is increased echoes, or if there is a discrepancy in the size of the kidney, you know that there is something wrong in the kidney. So, and renal disease could be renoparenchymal, which is very easily shown by ultrasound and by presence of proteinuria or raised urea creatinine, or it could be renovascular. Renovascular can be very occult. Everything may look normal, but they might have renal arterial hypertension, renovascular disease at the arterial level or the aortic level, etc. And it is not as uncommon as you think. It is more common even in the elderly. Atherosclerotic aortic disease and renal artery disease is quite common. And in younger people, it could be fibromuscular dysplasia. So I'm not going to the details. All this is just an ultrasound. So this is a normal looking kidney with normal cortical echoes, and anybody would report an increased cortical echoes. But this is to just to show you the discrepancy in the size between the right and the left kidney. You see that the right kidney is smaller, and this is renal Doppler. So when you are in doubt, one non-invasive method is to do a renal Doppler. You find this is the normal Doppler pattern. You see that the pattern is like this. But when there is renal artery stenosis, you have a Parvus-Todus pattern where there is blunting of the peak systolic velocity. So anyway, the radiologist will be there to guide you. But this is just to show that when renal artery stenosis was picked up like this, and he was revascularized with a stent in time, and you see the post-intervention changes in the renal Doppler pattern. So this is Parvus-Todus, this is normal. So that is kidney. I won't go any deeper in that. So there is always kidney disease causing hypertension, and there will be also hypertension causing renal disease. So let us not go into the depth of all this, but presence of renal problem, you'll have to think of a secondary hypertension. And adrenal disease, again, it is a vast area and very cumbersome to finish off in this session. But just remember, you have cortex and medulla. Cortex predominantly secretes two substances, aldosterone and cortisol. And for all practical, cortisol causing hypertension, maybe Cushing's and Cushingoid will be very obvious on the face. But aldosterone causing hypertension in the way of Conn syndrome or primary hyperaldosteronism was thought to be a very rare entity, but now we think that in resistant hypertension, patients who are not easily controlled, 15 to 20% of them do have, there are recorded series, 15 to 20% of them have hyperaldosteronism or Conn syndrome. This is very important to recognize them because this is easily treatable. And one good clinical marker is by looking at the potassium. If somebody has hypokalemia, which is not explained by vomiting, diarrhea, or drugs like diuretics, then you think of an hyperaldosterone pattern in the system and you go chasing them. And there are methods, let us not go into the depth. And from the medulla, it is all catecholamines. And, you're familiar with pheochromocytomas. Again, it is not rare, but many of them have telltale evidence of flushes and, episodes of tachyarrhythmias and palpitations and, fluctuations in the BP and so on. So you go on to proceed, investigate them in the form of 24-hour urinary VMAs and catecholamines. But collecting 24-hour urine and the reliability of these tests are a big problem. Many times we do suspect and we try to get it done in our place or we send it to some other place. Collection is a problem. The can has to be, prepared by the lab by adding acidifying material and all that. If any mistake comes, the values will come wrong. But now plasma catecholamines are being tested, plasma metanephrines. I think they are more easier and more reliable. So we should, when we think of all this and try to chase them, we should know the issues with 24-hour collection and problems. And this is for diagnosis of hyperaldosteronism. It is renin-aldosterone ratio. So renin-aldosterone ratio is the one which is going to give us this diagnosis. But again, there are many issues in that. Whether it is renin activity or it is measured renin. And when you talk about the ratios, then we now know that the aldosterone has to be beyond normal, at least twice the normal, then only you talk about the ratio. So let us reserve that, but this is not uncommon as we think. Coming back to our case, so that man had an ultrasound done, he had normal kidneys, there was no obvious evidence of parenchymal or a renovascular disease. And for some reason, he had this computed tomography, CT angiogram done, which I didn't ask for, which was again normal, which I wouldn't have really asked in this case. And his renin-aldosterone was tested because his potassium was in the borderline status and his renin was low. So for a person who is on multiple drugs, including diuretics, you would expect the renin values to be higher. But it was quite low, less than 0.1. Normal is 1.5 to 3.5. So that gave us a spark that this could be something to do with adrenal or Conn syndrome. But his aldosterone was not high. You see, aldosterone was only 8, normal being 3 to 15. So low renin in the face of normal aldosterone may not mean much. So this ratio is quite adverse. So, PRA, the plasma aldosterone renin ratio is more than, say, 25 or 30 here, which is actually a definitive indicator of Conn syndrome. But with a normal aldosterone level, you don't calculate you don't give that much importance to the ratio. And his again, this plasma metanephrine and his CT scan were with him, which actually I didn't ask for, and it was normal. So this is just to tell you that most of the obvious secondary causes are being ruled out. Only the red herring was this low renin. Then he was an obese man, I told you. I mean, he had some obesity. His BMI was not very high, but it was 31 or 32. So I should tell you something more about this obstructive sleep apnea or sleep disorder, which was a subject we laughed about previously, but now we are coming to realize that it is a lot of importance in blood pressure, cardiac disease, metabolic syndrome, and so on. And in day-to-day life also, there could be people who are failing miserably because of this. Actually, I came across a senior IAS officer while traveling in a train, and he was very depressed because the previous night when he was trying to sleep, he was very loudly snoring, and the other inmates of that cabin had to sort of wake him up, and he had to walk away from the cabin. So the next day morning, he was sitting along with me in another area, and he was very sadly talking to me about this. He never realized that he is something called OSA. He was a very learned man. And then when I asked him that whether he gets daytime sleepiness, feeling tired and losing interest in work and all that, he was telling yes to all these questions. Then he even gave me an instance where he was sitting in a board meeting where his superiors were there, and his superiors will be, chief secretary or chief minister. This man started sleeping during the course of the meeting, right next to the senior officer. You can expect the reaction from the senior officers. He was immediately suspended and he was taken into action. His whole career was in problem because of this very benign looking problem of obstructive sleep problem. And then I suggested him to undergo this test, and he was given CPAP, and he has become a very changed man. So likewise, so it is not only more diseases due to OSA, but your life can be utterly changed by this unrecognized OSA. Now we know that hypertensives, nearly 40% of them can have OSA, and in this resistant group, as high as 70%. So please, just look at them. If they are obese, don't ask them, ask their spouses or somebody who comes with them whether they snore in the night, because mostly the patient may not know or they will refuse. And there are studies which tells us that just use of CPAP could reduce the BP, like how weight reduction and salt reduction, use of CPAP alone could reduce BP in some of this resistant hypertensive patients. And but the funny thing is, you have pathophysiological mechanism in both in OSA and in in other mechanism of hypertension. So you can't very definitely point out at sleep apnea as the cause, but you'll have to keep this in mind. And this is to just to show you how the person with sleep apnea, their adrenergic drive is so high, their sympathetic system is so highly active, and so treatment of them will be slightly different besides using CPAP. So what are the aberrations, what we have discussed, what you come across in this? We try to describe what is the levels and what is resistant hypertension. We saw a case and we concluded that he has resistant hypertension. We have ruled out secondary hypertension. And these are the physiological aberrations which are there in a resistant hypertension. This is what makes them more prone for all those comorbidity and organ dysfunctions. They have more atherosclerosis, they have endothelial dysfunction, arterial compliance goes down, their vascular resistance goes up, and in general, all these aberrations, when you put them together, one common thing is they all indicate increased salt sensitivity. In other words, the indicators of or the pathophysiological mechanism or derangements, what you see in this a particular group of hypertensives called resistant hypertension, you see that they have all markers for increased salt sensitivity. So coming to the point, so it is this group of patients is they're not secondary hypertension, they're not very different, but they are simply somebody with increased salt sensitivity. So giving us the importance of kidney, and that will guide us to choose the best drugs to reduce salt sensitivity in these patients. So coming back to our case, so this is a case of resistant hypertension. He had no pseudo or lifestyle problems, no obvious secondary causes. Though he had high BMI, there was no obvious OSA. He did not deserve a sleep test, but he did not have obvious OSA, but that could be contributing. And he has some low renin, but his aldosterone-renin ratio was not adverse. So he had no obvious primary hyperaldosteronism or Conn syndrome, but he did have low renin. So this is again a marker of this resistant hypertension, and this is a marker of salt sensitivity. Then, so how to approach as far as treatment is concerned in this resistant patient? So let us start with the drugs he was already on. So he was on hydrochlorothiazide. Now many of us know that we don't prefer short-acting diuretics like hydrochlorothiazide. We prefer long-acting drugs. He was on good dose of sartan. He was on non-dihydropyridine calcium channel blocker diltiazem 90 milligram. Which is maybe not very appropriate in this situation. He should have been on dihydropyridine calcium channel blocker, and again, particularly long-acting ones like the retard preparations of nifedipine or amlodipine, which is by inherently a long-acting drug. Then coming to the renal problems with these calcium channel blockers, I won't be discussing today. I might have some reservation with amlodipine and such drugs, but as an antihypertensive drug, long-acting calcium channel blockers like nifedipine, Nicardia, nifedipine retard preparations, and amlodipine are good drugs. So that should have been there, but he was on this. And he was on other good ones like clonidine to reduce the sympathetic tone and on beta blocker. So let us see how we should go about. So primarily, we should start with one drug that's for regular hypertensive patients. For somebody with resistant hypertension, they should be on group of drugs, and we choose the group of drugs from the pathophysiology of hypertension. We know that salt is a major pathophysiological problem in resistant hypertension. Then the autoregulation of the vasculature, the afferent efferent arteriole and the peripheral vasculature. So the calcium channel blockers, hydralazine, minoxidil, all this act on the autoregulation at the vascular level. Then the humoral mechanism through ACE inhibition, ARB, and the mineralocorticoid system, so spironolactone. Then, of course, if the sympathetic activity has to be reduced, we have to use adrenergic blockers, alpha or beta. So we'll start with diuretic. So diuretic, it is better to choose a long-acting diuretic and not a short-acting diuretic. So this patient will have to change chlorthalidone, from hydrochlorothiazide to either indapamide or chlorthalidone. So it is your choice, depending on the cost and availability. These are better as far as BP reduction is concerned, more than a diuretic. And they have more anti-hypertensive effect. But you have a catch here. Whenever the GFR goes below 30 ml, your thiazides and indapamide will not act. You will have to discard them and go for other loop diuretics like Lasix or torezamide, etc. So please keep in mind, no use continuing thiazides or indapamide when there is progressive renal failure. And the problem of hyponatremia is really there. And many a times it is missed, and many a times the hydrochlorothiazide or the chlorthalidone part of your prescription is missed because they come in combination. They'll be on Telsar H or atenolol plus thiazide, and this H is not very obvious to the eye. Over the years, over the months and years, these patients continue to be on that, and many of them present with hyponatremia and problems of altered sensorium and things. So please remember that to keep hyponatremia and hypokalemia in mind when somebody is on diuretics. And don't rush and jump at conclusion of Conn syndrome and secondary hypertension when you see hypokalemia when somebody is on diuretics. You think of that, correct hypokalemia, you alter the dose, then chase the hypokalemia. And in these resistant cases, when talking about diuretics, I should also mention that even with good diuretic therapy, you think you have put them in good diuretic therapy, there could be an element of volume excess. This volume excess without edema. So there is a space between obvious edema and a normal hydration. So volume expansion can be there without obvious edema. So your diuretic therapy may not be adequate. So you may have to broaden your antidiuretic effect or increase their dose or reduce their salt intake. So keep this in mind. And some markers will be checking their BNP and ANP levels. So these, when there is volume expansion, these levels are high. The atyl natriuretic peptide and brain-based natriuretic peptides. So they are all costly investigation. We use it in acute situation, but they can indirectly tell you about the hydration status of a patient. Now we also have this body composition measurement equipments are there. I have it in my dialysis room to check the fluid status. When your body habits of a patient may not allow proper clinical evaluation of the hydration status. So this BCM estimation can be of use. So it is just to tell you that salt restriction and higher dose of diuretics may be indicated in our patient, although he is not obviously overhydrated. So from as far as resistant hypertension is concerned, you'll have to have this combination of these three groups. Yeah, A, C, and D. A is either ACE inhibitor, ARB in the ROS inhibition, and C is your calcium channel blocker, preferably dihydropyridine calcium channel blocker, and more preferably long-acting ones, either amlodipine or a retard preparation of nifedipine, and a diuretic. And so this man, our man already has all this. Only thing is his thiazide dose may not be enough. So I increase his diuretic and I ask him to restrict sodium further. And this combination is very rational because they act on different mechanisms. They sort of balance the counter mechanism as well. And from there, from these three drugs, we'll have to go on to the next step. And in our man, he had this low renin. And large studies have shown that even though they may not have obvious hyperaldosteronism, addition of spironolactone can be a very useful step in patients with resistant hypertension. And if you think they are, especially if they are volume expanded, that is the first thing you add to your diuretic. And if you think their sympathetic nervous system is very active, then you start adding alpha or beta blocker, then go on and try with spironolactone. And if their arterial stiffness is more, if you think, then you'll have to start all the three. So this is how you approach a case of resistant hypertension. The occult or the hidden volume expansion should be tackled. And if you added other steps, then you try thinking of spironolactone, which is the a surprise solution which has been given to us for tackling this resistant hypertension. So that is coming as a fourth line and a very important one. But this is not based on hormonal data, because in our patient itself, I told you that by hormonal study, he doesn't fit into hyperaldosteronism, but yet he requires spironolactone. This was brought about by very good large studies, ASCOT study, where when they added spironolactone, there was drastic reduction in BP in this group of patients. And there are other studies like Pathway 2 trial, which again reconfirmed this solution. And when adding drugs, again, regimens should be simplified, and you try to use long-acting combinations so that the duration of action is prolonged, so your number of doses is reduced, and it goes a long way in increasing the compliance of the patient. And having easily said that you can use spironolactone, I should warn you that the risk of hyperkalemia. How, when I told you about adding diuretic, I talked to you about hyponatremia and hypokalemia. Spironolactone, you should be aware of hyperkalemia. So they should be already on some beta blocker, which can cause hyperkalemia. They'll be already on ACE inhibitor or AR inhibitor, ARB. Again, that can cause hyperkalemia. So addition of spironolactone as a fourth drug will put them utterly on risk for hyperkalemia. And there is a general habit of people to simply add oral potassium whenever they put them on diuretic. That has become a involuntary prescription practice to many people. When they add a diuretic, they'll add a potassium supplement. So all this put together, this patient may get into hyperkalemia. They may present to you with simply bradycardia or sometimes sudden death also. And this is more so when the GFR is getting low. So these resistant hypertension patients are more prone for organ dysfunction, especially kidney. So when you keep progress, watching them, you can get a stage where the GFR goes below 45. Then stop spironolactone or be very, very careful. And it is a good idea not to use it when it approaches 5. 4.5 to 5, be very careful. But now we tend to use it because it has a lot of other goodness also in reducing hypertrophy of the heart, in reversing fibrosis in the kidney and so on. So we tend to add this and keep the potassium under control by strict diet and also by adding potassium binders. And when they don't tolerate spironolactone, because some of them can develop gynecomastia, then you go for the alternative eplerenone, which is available, but it is costly. So the art of prescribing in this long-standing hypertension, which is becoming resistant, is to have a combination of antihypertensives and use medications which are not complementary, which have two different mechanisms, so they become complementary but not overlapping. Don't use two drugs with the same mechanism of action, and you minimize the side effects by not maximizing the dose of one drug but making more drugs, and by looking at the pharmacology and by playing with the drugs. Like example, if you add ACE inhibitor to a diuretic, it can reduce the hypokalemia, because this will cause hyperkalemia, diuretic will cause hypokalemia, so it can strike a balance. Again, use of ACE inhibitor or ARB to reduce the edema of calcium channel blocker, or use of diuretic to reduce the chance of edema in a CCB used patient. So likewise, when adding new drug, you keep this in mind. So coming to our patient now, so he came with very high BP, uncontrolled BP, and he was on 5 drugs. So first thing we did was we increased his, we changed his thiazide, hydrochlorothiazide to chlorthalidone, and we increased the dose. And the second step was I added a dose of aldactone, spironolactone. And doing this, his BP started coming down very rapidly. So I could easily first stop the clonidine. Nothing happened. BP continued to fall down. Then I stopped his beta blocker. Then again, the BP continued to remain okay. Then the other one he was on was calcium channel blocker, which any other time, see, I have a habit of not immediately changing somebody else's prescription, so I let it continue for some time. Otherwise, it would have been a better idea to change it to a long-acting dihydropyridine calcium channel blocker like nifedipine long-acting or amlodipine. But I tried stopping diltiazem, but I found that there was again a slight rise in BP. So there was a role of this auto-regulating group of drugs, calcium channel blockers. So then I re-added a small dose of retard preparation of nifedipine. Now you see that he is on very few drugs. He is on a diuretic, he is on aldactone, and he is on nifedipine, and his BP is fairly under control. And we have sort of, we can remove him from the label of resistant hypertension. So in any hypertension, keeping all this in mind, whatever I say, it is a good routine practice to do this investigation so that you don't miss any secondary hypertension or you don't miss any sleep apnea, etc. You do the electrolytes, look for sodium, potassium. If it is hypokalemia, think of aldosterone. If the hyperkalemia, you reduce the dose of ACE inhibitor and his diet. And albuminuria, and check for urine analysis and urea creatinine to rule out secondary hypertension from the kidney. Do ultrasound, kidney size, and the echogenicity, and Doppler to rule out renal artery stenosis. And strict sodium restriction, if you want to really recheck his words, do a 24-hour urine sodium excretion. That will bring the cat out of the mouse out of the trap. Then if still you have doubt, then you can do a plasma aldosterone and the renin level and the ratio. And if the renin is low and aldosterone normal, it could be again a good candidate for adding spironolactone. And the 20% of patients in resistant hypertension who are really primary hyperaldosteronism, then you got a price diagnosis, you will get them. So it is a good practice to include all this in your approach to these patients. I told you in screening some of these patients, nearly 11 to 15% had primary aldosteronism. We thought Conn syndrome was a very rare endocrinological disease. So having seen hypertension, resistant hypertension, and we have tried to rule out very briefly some of the secondary causes. And this is the refractory hypertension, the 3%. And please understand that it is not a severe form of resistant hypertension. It is a different phenotype. It's a different type of group of patient. Refractory is different from resistant. They have blood pressure that remains uncontrolled in spite of maximum medical therapy. So pathophysiologically, they are different. In resistant hypertension, it is more volume dependent, and so renin is low. So we thought of adding aldactone, spironolactone. But this refractory hypertension is predominantly likely to be neurogenic etiology. It is sympathetic system driven problem. So they need a different sort of approach, and I will not be going to the details today. So, but clinically, you can make a slight difference. So between resistant and refractory, see risk factors, in resistant hypertension, it is predominantly old age, males, obese, who take more salt. There can be white coat hypertension, there can be some renal dysfunction. These are all in the resistant hypertension about which we discussed all this while. But in refractory hypertension, it could be in females and it could be race dependent. There is some genetic mechanism. In the US, they say Afro-Americans, black population have more of this refractory hypertension. And the heightened sympathetic activity in this refractory group, that small group, can be sort of given a clue by high heart rate. See, this man had a heart rate of 70, but he was on metoprolol. So high heart rate and less heart rate variability. They don't have periods of brady and tachy. And their urinary norepinephrine can be high if you measure. And all this leading to a high peripheral vascular resistance and very refractory hypertension. And they are not volume dependent. So the renin may not be as indicative as in resistant hypertension, and their BNP and atyl natriuretic peptide may not be high. And those patients would require very close watch by specialists, and they may be, resorted to some of these potential treatment modalities which are available to us now but not being used very much because there are varying evidences for and against them. One is baroreceptor stimulation by various equipments, and this came up with a very great bang but went out because of the simplicity trial. Renal denervation, which is technically not difficult, by just putting in a renal catheter inside the renal artery and you denervate by giving a current. And this denervation first was taken up very aggressively, but simplicity trial proved otherwise. But now again it is coming into vogue in selected cases. If you choose cases like this, what I have done now, you leave all those pseudo-resistant, resistant, secondary hypertension, you concentrate on the refractory. Then now the new trial, renal denervation trial, Denner hypertension. These newer trials are giving some good support for renal denervation, and these may be available for us to use in the future. I think I have come to the end of the talk. So this was not exactly only on resistant hypertension. I tried to give you an overview of importance of hypertension, how we should be giving more attention in diagnosing, and small mistakes we do right from the technique of taking BP and delegating this to the ward sisters, and depending on that for our treatment, and all these things I try to cover, and I try to tell you how you should separate out this group of resistant hypertension, ruling out secondary hypertension, and how to approach this case, and how this novel way of adding spironolactone is going to help in these patients. And I think that should have helped you to a certain extent. And if there are anything more to talk, I think we'll take from the questions from the audience. Thank you once again to all of you.
Thank you very much, sir. Giving on a nice lecture. I'm also seeing that after a long time, people are there as understanding from the detection and the stage of hypertension, where you are elaborated very nicely. I'm very much feeling happy on this. In this group, many doctors are learning about this from your end. And straight away, hand over the session to our GM marketing, Mr. Arvind Kusu was there. He'll be taking few section, question and answer. Arvind.
Good evening to all delegates and Dr. Bala Subramaniam. It was in-depth presentation on resistant hypertension and nicely covered all the aspects. So in chat box, there are a few questions which I'll be reading for you. The first question which has come from audience is, what are the biomarkers of hyperaldosteronism?
One clinical marker I told you is hypokalemia. And if you think, somebody has persistent hypokalemia not explained by diuretics or dietary habits, etc. But again, to warn you, only 40 to 50% of these patients with this pakka primary hyperaldosteronism have hypokalemia. So there can be normokalemia also. So if they are in the normal or lower normal range, the low range, keep this in mind. And you rule out secondary causes, renal causes, then you think of this. Then you try to check the renin and aldosterone level. Now it is available. It is not in Tirunelveli or in smaller places. You'll have to send it out, but it can be practically done. But there are some caveats in trying to do this PRA. This renin aldosterone ratio. How you take it in the morning, fasting. You'll have to see that there is no spurious reduction in renin. So if they are, you'll have to really overhydrate them, or hydration should be adequate. You make them stand and be walk around for some time before taking. See, all these instructions given by the laboratory people should be carried out well to get a very satisfactory level of renin. Then you have the aldosterone. Aldosterone, no issue, but the ratio then matters. But this resistant hypertension is a situation where you have this low renin, but aldosterone is normal. So, and again, the spironolactone will be very useful.
Second question, sir, even in fact, we would like to learn also, if you look